You also look for comparisons and contrast. Focus on how things are similar. That's what a comparison is. How are things similar? Items, ideas, people, and so forth. Let's go to Proverbs, because they're always full of good comparisons using the word like or as, which, by the way, is a simile. You'll see that in the right-hand side. I'm married to an English grammar fanatic, so we've got to make sure we get all that in. All right, comparisons using the word like. Look at Proverbs 25:26. Like a muddied spring or a polluted well is, there's the comparison, a righteous man who gives way to the wicked. Okay, now look, think of it. In comparisons, you ask first of all, what does a muddied spring and a polluted well look like? What's going on? It's polluted, it's dirty, it's certainly not what you would want a well to be like, and it's certainly not what you'd want a stream to be like. Oh, let's go swimming in the watering hole down there, just below the pollution plant or whatever. No, we want purity. We want refreshment. We want life-giving water and all that. And notice what he's saying about life. He's saying that if you know what a muddied spring, as opposed to a pure spring, or a polluted well as opposed to a pure well is like, that's what happens when a righteous man can't remain distinctive and righteous, but he gives way, or he becomes like, or compromises with wicked people. It's the very advice we give our kids. We tell our kids all the time, watch who you hang out with. You're going to become like the people you hang with. Why? Because Proverbs 25:26 tells us that there's a comparison between this is what's going to happen, like a muddied spring or a polluted well, is the righteous man who compromises and starts living like the unrighteous people that he's hanging out with. Okay? In other words, a spring or a well, it's a conduit for life-giving water, and the conduit is polluted, and the water remains unusable. Therefore, a righteous man, good water, who gives way to the wicked, polluted man, is muddied and loses his flavor, he loses his purity, he loses his usefulness. That's the kind of idea that's trying to come out of this kind of a comparison. And so what I have discovered, and I don't know, you may be different, but what I've discovered is when you read Proverbs, you don't read a chapter of Proverbs. You read in Proverbs until you hit one, you go, oh, I want to think about this one. And you do a proverb a day. I mean, you do a single verse. You chew on a verse at a time. Or what I do is I often will read a chapter of Proverbs to correspond with the day of the month. There are 30 chapters in Proverbs, so on the first of the month I read Proverbs 1, but as I'm reading, I'll always hit a one particular proverb, and I'll say, okay, that's it. This is the one for the day. And I'll just really think about that, and I'll mark it up and so forth and so on. Okay, just an idea. Practice again. James 3:3-6 compares the tongue to three things. And so what I'd like for you to do is underline, maybe double underline, the three similarities. The tongue is being compared to three things. See if you can find those three things in verses 3-6. All right, let's begin this way. Look at verse 5. Likewise, and circle the tongue. Circle the tongue. That's the point of comparison. The tongue is being compared to three other things because there's similarity to those three other things to the power of a tongue. And the first thing is what? The bit. So double underline bit. Verse 3, when we put bits into the horse's mouth. Compared to a horse, would we all agree, a bit is small. But it has the power and capacity to steer and control a horse. You with me? There's the first comparison. All right, take verse 4. Ships as an example. What's the comparison point? The rudder. And it says not a rudder. What kind of rudder? A small rudder can have the capacity to steer a powerful large ship. Right? So straightforward, that's good. So the tongue is like a bit in the mouth of a horse. The tongue is like a very small rudder that steers a large ship. And then finally, the tongue is like what? Right in front of verse 6, small spark. Doesn't just say spark, a small spark. Small rudder, small bit. We'll add that in our minds. Small bit, small rudder, small spark, and a small spark can ignite a fire. And now we do a video clip of Los Angeles and their perennial fires that they have that are always started by something small and it goes out of control. And the idea here is something that starts and then becomes destructive out of control. A bit has a value of controlling a powerful horse. A rudder has a value of controlling a large, powerful ship. A small spark is something that ignites an uncontrollable, out of raging fire, a destructive fire. And then he goes on to say, verse 6, the tongue is also a fire. It's more like a fire than it is a bit or a rudder. The tongue is like a fire, a world of evil among the parts of the body. The idea is the tongue is small part of the body, but it controls who we are, what we say, and how others perceive us, and the kind of trouble that we can cause. And suddenly you're thinking in your mind as you're reading through this, you're writing out into the margin, gossip, question mark. Because is that not what gossip is? It's a bunch of little sparks that just start a raging fire. That's why it's so destructive. Is if we can't control those wildfires in Arizona and California, the ones they were having in Texas this past summer, why do we think just the indiscriminate firing of our mouth is going to be controllable as well? It's probably not. So, you think through things like this. How is the tongue like a bit? A small thing can control a large animal, so the tongue can control my life, if properly used. How is the tongue like a rudder? Well, a small rudder can steer a large ship. My small tongue could steer my whole person. How is the tongue like a small spark? Small spark can start a raging forest fire, and my tongue can start or speak a small evil that can grow large and can become a raging fire. And all of this is around the biblical observational principle of comparison. And if you're reading through this, or even studying it, or attempting to teach it, and you don't see that this is a strong piece on comparison, then you'll miss the whole passage. Look on the right-hand side in the shaded section on 45. Simile, when you see the word like or as, it's a simile. If like and as is missing, it's called a metaphor. It's still a comparison, but a metaphor is a comparison not using like or as. If we say fellowship is a greenhouse, that's a metaphor. If we say fellowship is like a greenhouse, it's a simile. It's whether or not you use like or as. But the idea is the same. You're comparing a known to a known in order to enrich and expand the meaning. Notice the verse we have below metaphor. This is from Psalm 18:2. The Lord is my, what's the word? Rock. That's a metaphor. It's a comparison. Now, you help me. God is like a rock. God is a rock. What does that say to you? Strong? What else? Say it again, I'm sorry. Solid? Strong, solid? Unmovable, unyielding, lasting, enduring, those kind of things. All right, what about the next? God is a fortress. Protection, safety, security, so forth. What about the last one? A deliverer. One who comes to my aid, helper. The cavalry. when you need them, you hear the little horn. Here comes God to rescue. Okay. When you meditate on Psalm 18:2, what you want to be able to do is not go over those because you're so familiar with hearing those things, you want to stop and think about it. Why would a biblical writer use a comparison in order to enrich my understanding of who God is? And then later you'll be taking a step of saying is, so what does that mean for me? Are there moments when I need God to be my rock? Are there times when I need Him to be my fortress that I can hide behind? Are there times when I need Him to bail me out? And the Scripture declares, God is that. That's what He is. That's who He is. And so forth. Okay, we'll do a real quick one on the other side. We won't have time. This is page 44 is a PBS exercise, but I want you to look at the bottom. I did some comparisons there. Look at the first one from Proverbs 25:11 to 14. A word aptly spoken is like, all right, that's a comparison. It's a simile. A word aptly spoken is like apples of gold in settings of silver. That sounds like wealth. That sounds like value. That sounds like something beautiful. That sounds like something precious. It sounds like something I'd like to have. You know, oh, honey, you don't have to buy me a huge big diamond ring with lots of other little diamonds around it. I'm okay. Right. Like an earring of gold or an ornament of fine gold is a wise man's rebuke to a listening ear. In other words, a wise man rebuking a teachable, humble man is like something very valuable along the lines of something made of gold, something expensive. We don't have time. Look at the last one because I love this one. This is one of my favorites. Like clouds and wind without rain is a man who boasts of gifts he will not give. Now here's a guy say, hey, I'm going to do this for you and I'm going to do for this, and he never comes through. And you think, you know what, that's just like clouds and wind with no rain. Now you've been on one of those days where, hey, it's going to rain. I can feel it in the air, the wind's blowing, the clouds are there, they've turned dark, it's going to rain, get your umbrellas, and it never rains. That's very much like a person who makes all kinds of promises, but they never follow through. Community pastors, take note in light of your community group leaders. All right, next page, page 47. Contrast. Well, of course, we've already talked about comparisons. We got to go to contrast. Contrast, top of page 47, focus on how things are different. You might want to circle that word different. In the right-hand side, in the shaded section, contrast, look for and circle the word but. That's usually a good indicator that you've got the possibility of a contrast going. Proverbs 14:31. He who oppresses the poor shows contempt for the Maker, for our Maker, for God. Just think about that. You might circle the phrase, he who oppresses. Just circle that. It just kind of leaps out. He who oppresses. Look down to the third line. But whoever is kind, circle that. Do you see the contrast? The one who oppresses contrasted to the one who is kind. The one who oppresses shows contempt for God. The one who is kind to the needy honors God. Real straightforward teaching, but it's better than saying God likes us to be nice to unfortunate people. Well, that's true. That's a true statement. This says it better. This says it stronger. He who oppresses the poor shows contempt for their Maker, but whoever is kind to the needy honors God. That's a good contrast. Or one we all know very well here at Fellowship in light of our Draw Near campaign. Look at James 4:6. God opposes the proud, but in contrast to that, gives grace to the humble. So you need to double underline proud, double underline humble. There's your points of contrast. And God is the initiator in both places. God will oppose the proud. God will give grace to the humble. And what's being contrasted here? Pride and humility. Pride and humility is being contrasted. And from the divine perspective. And you get God's insight on what's important there. All right, 1 John 1, 5 to 7. Since we're running close on the time, let me just kind of walk through this one for you. 1 John 1:5 said, "This is the message we've heard from him and announced or declare to you. God is," underline it twice, "light. In him there is no," what's the word? All right, underline darkness. What's being contrasted? Light and darkness. If we claim to have fellowship with him and yet walk in the darkness, we lie and do not live by the truth. Circle lie and circle truth. There's another contrast in this passage. But if we walk in the light as opposed to walking in darkness, there's a hidden contrast. If we walk in the light as God, Jesus, is in the light, we have fellowship with one another, and the blood of Jesus keeps on cleansing us from the daily sin that pollutes us. It's not talking about salvation sin. He's talking about the daily sin that breaks our fellowship with God. So now you got in that passage, asked the question, what's the major contrast? Light versus darkness. Are there other contrasts? Yes, lie versus truth. And what is the basic metaphor? God is light. And you want to say, what does light bring? Well, it reveals. Light even brings life. Light brings knowledge. Light brings clarity, and so forth and so on. And so we're comparing that if I'm walking with God, in fellowship with God, I'm walking in light. I get all those things. Things are clearer, etc., and so forth. But if I'm walking in the darkness on my own agenda and got my old secret sins going, if I'm walking in darkness, then things are cloudy, it's uncertain, it's untruthful, it's unbiblical, and so forth and so on. So that's the contrast. And so if you're studying 1 John, which is a very difficult little letter to study, when you're studying 1 John and you're in this passage right here, you want to make sure that you see that as you're in your observation phase. You're not sure what you'll do with it, you just want to make sure that you see it.